Was under duress. The committee shall come to order. We are meeting today to consider 8 pieces of legislation. All have been properly noticed and circulated. There are copies available on each side of the dais, along with copies of timely filed amendments, of which there were none. Late amendments have been circulated electronically and will be distributed to members present at the dais. Pursuant to committee rules, other members of the committee may submit written opening statements for the record. I ask the members may revise and extend the remarks on the bills to be considered at this markup, and those remarks will be included in the record. Without objection, so ordered. Without objection, the chair may also declare a recess subject to the call of the chair. Pursuant to Committee Rule 3I, House Rule 11, and Clause 2, I announce that I may postpone further proceedings today on the question of approving any measure or matter or adopting an amendment on which a recorded vote for the yeas and nays has been ordered. Let me now ask the ranking member for any opening comments he may have.
Well, I thank you for that courtesy. I am not heartened to be here today in what is going to be a very divisive slate of bills that are before us. This is certainly not in keeping with Mr. Grijalva's usual pattern of having markups, but they are becoming much more partisan and much more divisive as time goes on here. Now, certainly when we were in charge, we were not perfect with this. There were times in which we did have all Republican bills on a markup, but there was always an extenuating circumstance to that. Generally, efforts to try and make sure that we had checked all the boxes for something that was going to be on the floor very soon before that. But without question, we no longer do that here. In the last session of Congress, this committee passed more bills than any other committee. We're well over 200. Roughly just under 30% of those were Democrat bills. Actually, 175 bills of our committee actually passed the House. Once again, about 28% of those were Democrat bills. That is not the ratio that you see before you today. In fact, before Friday of last evening, when the final markup was sent out, there were 2 bills to be considered that were Republican bills. Mr. Gosar had a bill that would have protected, incentivized increased development of wind and solar and geothermal energy on public lands. It was a bipartisan bill. Mr. Heiss had a bipartisan bill as well, which would have protected national significant battlefields, not only for the Civil War, but also for the American Revolution and the War of 1812. Both of those were dropped. What we are left with is 8 bills that are extremely partisan, check the box for some left special interest groups, but they actually have, in fact, only one of those 8 has any kind of Republican co-sponsorship. Your bill has 1 Republican co-sponsor. The rest of those are totally devoid of anything from the minority, which is, once again, one of those things that is sad. I also notice a sense of irony in what we are about to do here today. The bills that are before us today would increase 1.5 million acres of new wilderness. They would designate 800+ miles of wild and scenic river, create 100,000 acres of monument expansions, and they would be a massive increase to the management burden the federal agencies already have. When indeed we still have a bill sitting on the floor with over 330 co-sponsors to find a management solution to our public lands. And yet that is still not moving on the floor as we speak. That is bipartisan. What Mr. Gosar and Mr. Heiss were trying to do would be bipartisan, but here we are once again in the midst of a very partisan markup that should not be there. As I said, Mr. Grijalva, I don't think this is your modus operandi, but I am tired of some of your staffers wanting to punish or train me in some particular way. It simply is not going to happen. So I have a great admiration for the process we have. This committee markup is a breakdown of that process. Now with that, Mr. Chairman, I move that the committee do adjourn.
Does the gentleman have the motion in writing, Mr. Bishop?
Yes. Sure.
We distribute that?
I would remind the chairman, obviously, this is a non-debatable motion that cannot be postponed.
Right. Right now, staff is making copies of the motion so we can distribute it to the members.
I appreciate that. It's a tough one to remember.
I will go, do you think you'll do this again? If so, then I'll go ahead and.
Just have staff, have someone staff run them off.
Mr. Chairman, I call the question. As a parliamentary rule, it doesn't need to have a printout.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, I believe the amendments are passed out.
Thank you. We have them.
Will the clerk read the motion and, that's before us?
Motion to adjourn.
The
Mr. Chairman, I move that the committee do now adjourn.
the gentleman moves that the committee do now adjourn. The question is on the gentleman's motion. No? And voting is open.
Oh, sorry. Voice vote.
All those in favor indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have
Mr.
it.
Chairman, request a recorded vote.
Recorded vote being requested. The voting is now open.
Gonzalez is not here. Town clerk.
I'm texting them right now. Keisha's not here, but he's at the doctor.
Mr. Chairman? Mr. Chairman? Mr. Chairman? Parliamentary inquiry, is there a committee rule on how long votes stay open?
My experience, sir, is as well as yours in this committee, that it's been the discretion of the chair.
Okay.
Have all members present voted? What's the score? I can't read.
17, we're good. You can vote.
Have any member want to change their vote? The vote is now closed, and the clerk will report.
Mr. Chair, on this vote, the yeas are 17 and the nays are 17.
Motion not pass, and in
5-minute recess.
and we're going to take about a 5-minute recess at this point to, subject to the college chair, to have a discussion as to how we're going to proceed forward. If this becomes sustaining of German votes for the rest of the afternoon, is a discussion that I want to broach with the ranking member, and we'll go from there, depending on how that goes. Thank you. 5 minutes.
What's the room number?
1329,
What?
1329.
Can I have my people meet 1329, just for a quick second? 1329 down the hall for a quick second.
Convene the meeting. If the members, as we reconvene, we're going to got it. I'm going to request unanimous consent that we add the two pieces of legislation that are bipartisan, sponsored by Mr. Gosar, Mr. Levin on one, and then Mr. Heiss and another member on another. And as soon as we get the specifics in terms of the title and the numbers, we'll go from there. I ask unanimous consent that H.R. 3794, sponsored by Mr. Gosar and Mr. Levin on the committee, and H.R. 307, sponsored by Mr. Heiss, be added as added to the agenda and noticed according to the rules. If there's no objection,
Mr. Chairman,
yes.
I want to say thank you very much.
Without objection, so ordered. And do I announce that we're re-changing the schedule?
No, you can, no,
Okay.
you can just go.
Let me be, the chair, the item for consideration at S2, 21-6, offered by Senator Cantwell. I ask unanimous consent the Subcommittee on Indigenous Peoples of the United States and the Subcommittee on Water, Oceans, and Wildlife be discharged from further consideration of the legislation. Without objection, the bill will be considered as read and open to amendment at any point. I will now recognize myself to speak on H.R. 21-6. S-21-6, the Spokane Tribe of Indians of the Spokane Reservation Equitable Compensation Act, introduced by Senator Cantwell of Washington, will finally compensate the Spokane Tribe of Indians for the flooding of their tribal lands that occurred with the construction of the Grand Coulee Dam more than 75 years ago. When the dam was built in the 1930s and 40s, the reservoir created flooded approximately 2,500 acres of Spokane Indian Reservation. These lands held great economic, cultural, and spiritual significance to the tribe and included the tribe's historic salmon fishing sites. Around the time of the dam's completion, the Indian Claims Commission Act of 1946 was enacted, which gave tribal nations 5 years to file all relevant land claims against the federal government. Although the Spokane tribe filed a claim before this deadline, which was settled in 1967 for around $4,700, lands related to the dam were not included. The end result is that more than 75 years later, the Spokane tribe has still not received just compensation for the seizure and destruction of their lands. This has severely impacted the ability of tribal government to provide for their community. This is an issue of fairness and equity. The only other tribe impacted by the construction of the Grand Coulee Dam, the Confederate Tribes of the Colville Reservation, successfully secured a settlement with the United States in 1994 and has been receiving compensation ever since. S-21-6 will require the Bonneville Power Administration to make annual payments to the tribe to match the company's electricity sales starting in 2022, much in the same way Colville tribes are compensated. S-216 has the support of the surrounding counties and local entities. Additionally, BPA stated at a recent subcommittee hearing on the bill that the annual payments to the tribe will not result in rate impacts to its utility customers. The Grand Coulee Dam and the energy it produces has been a financial boon to the United States and the citizens of the Northwest. It is now time to make whole the Spokane tribe for their sacrifice. I urge my colleagues to support the bill, yield back, and any other member wish to speak to the legislation?
Mr. Chairman,
Where? Sir?
I have an amendment at the desk.
Any general comments? We're open for.
We'll wait for general comment. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Is there further debate before we begin the amendment process? Representative Fulcher, you have the First Amendment designated as number 3. You're recognized for 5 minutes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, please understand my intent is to offer and withdraw.
Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, Grand Coulee Dam is a critical component of North Idaho's economy and for the rest of the Northwest. Hydropower has a long history in the region. In Idaho, the Columbia River Basin and its hydropower facilities provide water and power for the multi-billion-dollar agriculture industry. As we disperse funds from Grand Coulee's operations, we should not use those funds to then attack the system. I want to be clear. I am not blaming the Spokane tribe or trying to target any one entity, but I want to take the opportunity to highlight the threat of litigation to the system. This amendment ensures these funds cannot be used to undermine operations at Grand Coulee Dam or Bonneville Power Administration or BPA that includes using these funds for litigation. In other words, don't take the money and then sue with it. As we enter next year, the Federal Columbia River Power System will issue a new biological opinion. Entities outside of the Columbia Basin may litigate this opinion if it does not specifically name dam breaching as the preferred alternative. I know the BPA ratepayers. I represent some of them. And they do not support their money being used for litigation that harms the hydropower system, especially if the intention is dam breaching. In Idaho, my constituents have overwhelmingly indicated that dam breaching would not be viable as it would harm agriculture irrigation interests, flood control, recreation, the port based in Lewiston, and of course, hydropower production. With that, Mr. Chairman, I withdraw my amendment and yield back.
The gentleman withdraws his amendment. Any further discussion on the amendment? Any other amendments?
Mr. Chair.
Go, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I fully support the intentions of the gentleman from Idaho. You know, if we're trying to take some type of compensation in regards to the hydropower, that money should not be used to destroy the very nature of the institution that is going to pay for them. It's kind of an oxymoron. So I thank the gentleman for his intent and withdrawal, but I also want to know that it is supported. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Gosar. And in brief response, with regards to the amendment, it runs headlong into the issue of sovereignty and runs headlong into the issue of trust responsibility. And going forward, and understanding the gentleman's intent to make a point about the continuance of that hydropower generation in the area, I think it would be a troubling issue going forward if this amendment were to continue. Because in the belief of many of us, it severely undermines tribal sovereignty, and that would be a legal issue in and of itself. Gentleman has withdrawn. Any other amendments? If there are no further amendments, the questions on adopting the legislation and order in favor reported to the House. All those in favor indicate by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed? No. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the bill is ordered favorably reported. The motion is to reconsider is laid on the table.
We need to do the motion for views.
Mr. Bishop?
Under Committee Rule 5C, I give notice of my intention to file additional dissenting views on the bill just considered, and I ask unanimous consent that this notice be extended to all members of the committee and to apply to all bills being considered by the committee today.
In the sequence and order of the agenda of the legislation we're seeing, we're going to move to prioritize committee members. And beginning with H.R. 2854, gentlelady from New York, Ms. Velasquez. The item for consideration is H.R. 2854, offered by Representative Velasquez. I ask unanimous consent that the Subcommittee on Water, Oceans, and Wildlife be discharged from further consideration of the legislation. Without objection, the bill will be considered as read and open to amendment at any point. I will now recognize the sponsor of the legislation, Representative Velasquez, to speak to the legislation.
Thank you, Mr.
You're
Chairman.
recognized for 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you. And let me first thank the gentle lady from American Samoa, Ms. Reservoir, for being an original co-sponsor of my bill. My legislation, the Protect Our Refugees Act, will reinstate a common sense regulation banning use of a group of toxic pesticides in wildlife refuges. These pesticides, popularly called neonics, have been connected to the severe decline of bees, migratory birds, and various species protected under the Endangered Species Act. As members of the Natural Resource Committee, it is our duty to uphold and maintain the biological integrity, diversity, and environmental health of America's public lands and waters, especially our wildlife refuges. Our National Wildlife Refuge System compromises more than 800 million acres of wildlife habitat that support more than 8,000 species of mammals, birds, reptiles, amphibians, fish, and marine life, and at least 380 threatened and endangered species of plants and animals. Allowing for the ongoing use of neonics on our refuges directly threatens not only our ecosystem, but 35,000 jobs, countless recreational and educational opportunities, and the billions of dollars generated in local sustainable economic revenue. Specifically, neonics use has been linked to adverse ecological effects, including honeybee colony collapse disorder and the depletion of indigenous bird populations due to a reduction in the quantity of insects. Recent studies from the National Toxicology Program at the National Institute of Health reveal that not only do neonics cause harm to our pollinators, but also harm human health. Just this September, Science magazine published a report conducted by Cornell University illustrating a decline of 3 billion birds in North America, stemming from many causes. In a time where North America has lost more than a quarter of its entire bird population, we must combat all relative contributions, including banning the use of toxic pesticides on our wildlife refuges. We cannot afford to damage our ecological system any further. The EPA's reversal of the ban of this pesticide on national wildlife refuges is damaging to the environment and public lands overall. The Protect Our Refuges Act of 2019 bans this harmful pesticide by canceling the current registration and prohibiting any future use of neonics pesticides on all national wildlife refuges. I urge my colleagues to support this legislation to protect public health and our nation's wildlife refuges. Thank you. I yield back.
Any further discussion on the legislation?
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Gosar.
I thank the chairman for the time and wish to state my opposition to this bill advancing out of the committee today. This bill is contrary to the position of the Environmental Protection Agency, which has repeatedly and consistently found that this class of insecticides be safe to human health and the environment, including wildlife, when used in accordance with the label. Neonics are critical to combating insect damages to crops, forests, wildlife habitat, and other areas. In fact, certain neonics have such a favorable safety profile for mammals that it is used in flea and tick control products that are applied directly to the surface skin area of dogs and cats. Supporting the elimination of the use of nicotinoids on any federal land sends mixed messages. If a pesticide applicator is using a product within the EPA's label parameters, which are clearly outlined on the product label, then exposure to non-targeted organisms will be kept at acceptable levels, regardless of whether these organisms are located on private, federal, state, or tribal lands. To ban the use of nicotinoids only on federal lands, such as a national wildlife refuge, outside of the EPA's risk assessment process is not only arbitrary, but it undermines the integrity and the legitimacy of EPA's pesticide risk assessment process, which is widely recognized as the best in the world. The public would question the government's decision to, quote, protect federal properties, but not others. It should be noted that the U.S. Forest Service could be impacted as well, where their lands overlap with national wildlife refuges. U.S. Forest Service has a large stake in proper pest management, as they have major forest and insect conditions that are carefully documented and must be properly managed to avoid catastrophic tree losses. In addition, my colleagues seem to fail to understand the real-world impacts of their actions. Again, this bill, like others, is simply not going to work in reality. We're facing a massive invasion of invasive species. Plants, animals, and insects from around the world are taking over our federal lands, destroying native species and harming our ability to conserve our lands. But after reading some special interest press release and trying to score some political points, we have a bill here that will disarm our land managers and cripple our ability to respond to new outbreaks. Regarding specific pest threats, neonics are used to combat the Asian longhorn beetle, a threat to hardwood forests in the northern U.S., especially in the northeast U.S. that kills ash, birch, elm, sycamore, maple, poplar, willow, and tree species. The Asian longhorn beetle is a major cause for concern due to its impact on maple trees, impacting both syrup and lumber productions in the Northeast. Neonics are used to combat the Asian longhorn beetle in urban areas as well. Neonics are critical in agriculture, protecting over 100 different crops around the world from an unlimited range of destructive insects, including tomatoes, berries, citrus, tree nuts,
Would the
and leafy
gentleman
greens.
yield?
I'm not done yet. I didn't interrupt you. Data and reports alleging these chemical threats to pollinators do not reflect real-world conditions and EPA-approved uses and are in stark contradiction to the experience of safe use over the past 20 years. These compounds have been extensively used in the U.S. For these reasons, I oppose this bill, urge my colleagues to join me in voting no. I thank the chairman, but I will yield to the gentlelady from New York.
Yes, you said that it will affect the agricultural economy. My legislation focuses on protecting our wildlife refuges and endangered
Reclaiming
species, not on agricultural
Reclaiming my
economy.
time. It indirectly does, because you can't have a one option and none of the above. It causes a contrarian verdict in regards to any aspect of public lands. And with that, I urge everybody to vote no.
Mr. Costa, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have tremendous respect for the author and regret that I have not been able to raise my concerns about the legislation. But I think that it overreaches the efforts that the Obama administration raised in trying to provide protection that the author is seeking to do in this legislation. And let me explain why. The blanket prohibition on the use of neonics, I think, goes beyond the parameters of the Obama's administration in the 2014 guidance memo. Let me read from that memo. July 17, 2014, Chief National Wildlife Rescue System James W. Kurth stated in his memo, there can be an appropriate and specialized uses of neonic pesticides and decisions for those uses in the service that are subject to review through all applicable laws, regulations, and policies, including, but not limited to, the National Environmental Policy Act. The problem, I think, with the legislation, and again, I regret that I wasn't able to raise this to the author beforehand, is that I think it has an effect of inhibiting invasive species eradication efforts in non-agricultural practice that would now be banned. And ironically, I think it could cause greater risk to non-targeted species by requiring that the non-neonics, which in some cases are more harmful to the targeted species. I represent one of the largest wetlands in Western America, in grasslands, and they deal with these issues all the time. Invasive species that are only eradicated by the use of neonics would thrive in wildlife refuges, providing them their own refuge from eradication efforts on lands outside of these wildlife refuges. It's a difficult situation, and I just think that the legislation then reduces the flexibility to deal with both the challenges of non-invasive species with invasive species. And again, I think the Obama administration, through administrative actions, tried to strike that balance, and I think this, in effect, changes those attempts to have that balance. And under the current draft form, I'm not going to be able to support the legislation. I thank the author for her work, so I'll be willing to work with you on it if you would like to.
Well, I welcome working with you on it. The fact of the matter is that the legislation was introduced a long time ago.
No, I
You
understand.
clearly stated and never reach out to me, but I am open to have a discussion before it goes to the floor.
Does anybody-
There is, if you allow me, overwhelming data from Cornell, American Bird Conservancy, the National Wildlife Research Center, and the Upper Midwest Environmental Science, showing neonics is linked to dramatic declines in bees and other pollinators. They are also suspected in declines in other species, along with insect-eating birds and bats. In spring of last year, 16 countries at EU Commission voted in favor of banning neonics. I don't know what is it that they know, the EU, that EPA doesn't know, but I welcome your offer.
Gentleman, you.
Thank the gentlewoman.
Anyone else wish to be recognized on the legislation? I recognize myself. This legislation, which I support, would prohibit the use of a class of harmful pesticides within the National Wildlife Refuge System. Neonics are proven to cause the decline of important pollinator species, including the honeybee. These pesticides can also have adverse human health impacts. 2014, the Obama administration stopped the use of these pesticides in the National Wildlife Refuge. In 2018, the Trump administration overturned that ban, putting those pollinators and wildlife that depends on them at risk once again. I think Representative Velasquez's bill rights the wrong by prohibiting the use of these toxic chemicals on our wildlife refuges. It is, I think it's an important step for species protection and utilizing our refuges, of which we have jurisdiction, to do so. And I urge adoption of the legislation. Is there any further debate before we begin the amendment process?
Mr. Chairman,
Oh, excuse me, sir.
thank you. I yield my time to Mr. Gosar.
Yeah, there's as much information in regards to this toxic to pollinators as this little device. This little device and the bandwidths are also screwing up as much of pollinators as we can see. So from that standpoint, we have to start looking at this very carefully and let the science go where we're going. So I trust our EPA versus anything that's done in the EU, and with that, I'll yield back.
Would you yield? Do you trust the National Institute of Health? Do you? because they are the one that came up with one of the studies.
I reclaim my time then. If that's the case, then we should take and ban it all the way across the board, not pick and choose where we're doing that. If that's the case of the gentlelady, then get after it. That we ought to have that conversation.
I think we do. Gentleman yields. Thank you. Is there any further discussion on the legislation? Seeing none, does any member wish to offer an amendment to the legislation? If there are there's no amendments, the question is now on adopting the legislation and order it favorably reported to the House. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and a recorded vote has been requested. This vote will be postponed pursuant to the prior announcement. Yeah, I did. That's what I did. The item for consideration is H.R. 2250, offered by Representative Huffman. I ask unanimous consent that the Subcommittee on National Park, Forests, and Public Lands be discharged from further consideration of the bill, and without objection, the bill will be considered as read and open to amendment at any point. I will now recognize Representative Huffman to speak to the legislation. Mr. Huffman, you're recognized.
Thank you very much, Chairman Grijalva, for including my bill, H.R. 2250, the Northwest California Wilderness Recreation and Working Forests Act, in today's markup. I'd also like to thank my colleagues on the committee who have co-sponsored the bill, and Senator Harris for leading this effort in the Senate. So this is a bill that would protect important wild places on federal lands. It would help restore forests and fish habitat, benefit local communities economically as well as wildlife, increase recreational opportunities and spur tourism, and protect communities by increasing fire resilience. The bill designates a 730,000-acre special restoration area in the South Fork Trinity River, Mad River, and North Fork Eel River watersheds. It supports redwoods restoration and would establish a partnership of federal, state, and local entities to restore public lands and waters that are damaged by something many of us in the West are concerned about, illegal trespass marijuana grow sites. The bill also focuses on recreation with a total of 295 miles of trails that offer opportunities for hiking, biking, horseback riding, and off-highway vehicle use. The bill proposes new visitor centers and overnight lodging to boost the rapidly growing outdoor recreation economy, and it benefits and its many benefits for communities around these valuable public lands. Lastly, the bill would result in 261,000 acres of wilderness and 379 miles of wild and scenic rivers, designating areas that are critical habitat for endangered salmon and steelhead, and that protects some of the largest intact old-growth oaks, conifers, and redwood forests remaining in California. These are areas that include some of the best fishing, swimming, and whitewater runs in the state. I'd also like to highlight that the bill before us today reflects input from diverse stakeholders over several years of working with communities throughout this part of my district. The development of this bill, the whole time, has included sitting down with constituents and stakeholders, presenting these proposals at public meetings, discussing concerns with local elected officials, including county supervisors. I have moved boundaries and removed wilderness proposals because of input we received from these stakeholders. We have made changes to address concerns raised by landowners, the timber industry, and tribes. So I believe this is a comprehensive, carefully developed bill. That's why it has such broad support, including from conservation organizations, outdoor recreation groups, and dozens of businesses and community leaders, local outfitters and guides, adjacent landowners, and former and current local elected officials in all of the affected counties in my district. Being active in the outdoors, experiencing wild places, and connecting to a healthy environment is the way of life for my constituents and for many visitors to the 2nd District. It's critical to take care of these places and to ensure a future for the communities that rely on them, and that's what my bill would do. So I respectfully urge my colleagues to support it, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Huffman. Anybody want to be recognized in the legislature?
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I regret the stereotype that too often when the bill comes from the opposing party, there must be something wrong with it. And so I undertook a deep study of this bill with my staff. I personally met with Mr. Huffman. And although there are things I would do differently, there are a number of things that I was impressed with. And maybe just to mention a few of those. First of all, let me remind everybody that this is his district, that he is the duly elected representative accountable to the people of his district, and that means a great deal to me, even if that means that the people in your district see things differently than the people in my district. The local support is significant, and although perhaps not perfect, rarely is in a bill of this nature, and I think that's very important that he's garnered the local support. It's clear to me that he's worked hard to build consensus and made changes to his bill that he may not otherwise do to build that consensus and listen to many stakeholders, including myself, and my thoughts on the bill. And I want to encourage that, and I want to show that we can work across the aisle even when we have different opinions, and that we can support each other on important public lands issues. And for that reason, I'll be supporting the bill today. I yield back.
Would the gentleman yield for a thank you?
Yes.
I want to thank Mr. Curtis for taking the time to sit down with me and walk through this bill. I really appreciate it. We don't do enough of that, just among all of our colleagues, but certainly across the aisle. That's a refreshing opportunity for dialogue and collaboration. And I especially appreciate the chance to share with him the evolution of this bill, because it started out as a proposal that was just wilderness. And I wanted to do more than that. I wanted to do something different, and it evolved into something that was very unique, I think, in terms of a public land bill, because it does include fire resiliency. It does include areas where there will be working forest activity. Some trees will be cut and logged and milled as a result of this bill. But it also does include wilderness and recreation and other values, and we have worked very, very hard to thread that needle of local support and to remove all of the local opposition for many of my local elected boards and commissions. So really grateful for the gentleman's open mind and collaboration and dialogue, and with that, I'll yield back.
Gentleman yields. Thank you. Anyone else? Mr. Costa?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I, too, want to commend Mr. Huffman on his hard work in putting together what is an important land use bill in an important part of California. Certainly, it takes in a beautiful part of California, and the efforts to try to maintain multi-purpose uses in any part of California is always a challenge. But working through that, I think you've come up with a measure that enjoys the support of both Senator Harris and Senator Feinstein, which is critical to the passage of this legislation. I do want to raise an issue that in California is always out there, and that is any potential impacts of water use. I think the author it's not his intention, and certainly the legislation doesn't, I think, speak to that. But anytime you deal with physical changes on reclamation facilities, sometimes it requires Section 7 determination. I think it's important to make a distinction between those physical changes. In this case, we're talking about potential Trinity River Restoration Program changes that including channel rehabilitation and gravel augmentation to try to improve fisheries, salmon and others, and also included, obviously, is the United States Forest Service in this efforts. Any potential changes that may or might occur are obviously always of concern. I know not only for myself, but for the author as well. I think it's a bit unclear on that point in terms of change of operations of existing water projects. I just wanted to raise that issue. The fact of the matter is that we're all interested in trying to protect and preserve important, valuable lands that this legislation attempts to pursue, and so I intend to vote for the measure. But obviously, anytime there are impacts of water, we always are concerned, and we want to try to make sure that we do not have the law of unintended consequences, which is a law that oftentimes happens, and I don't think it's the author's intent. And as again, I think this is a good piece of legislation. I intend to support it. Yield.
Thank you. I want anyone else, Mr. Gosar.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Unfortunately, I oppose the legislation before us. H.R. 2250, offered by the gentleman from California, would create over 262,000 acres of new wilderness, effectively restricting forest management across wide swaths of federal lands. This proposal is a bad idea at a time when California is facing extreme wildfire hazards, and we're all focusing on how to streamline environmental regulations to reduce such risks. This part of California is no stranger to the dangers of wildfires. Just 2 years ago, in 2017, the Helena fire near Trinity Alps Wilderness burned over 21,000 acres and destroyed 72 homes, threatening life and property of thousands of our citizens. It is clear that the lopsided bill before us fails to achieve the type of balance and local consensus that I believe is necessary for a bill of this size. This massive land grab is just that, a Wilderness Society fundraising mailer masquerading as policy. At the July 10th hearing for this bill, this committee heard testimony from Trinity County Supervisor Keith Groves. 76% of the land in Trinity County is controlled by the federal government. An enormous 95% of the lands impacted by this bill are located in Trinity County. At the summer hearing, Mr. Groves testified that the county had several concerns with Mr. Huffman's bill. The concerns range from questions about grazing implications, road decommissioning, forest management, and stewardship contracts. These concerns have not been addressed, and Trinity County has not endorsed the bill. The Forest Service, in their testimony, also had criticisms of the legislation as well. Perhaps most troubling is the fact that many of the wild and scenic river designations and all of the wilderness additions contained in this bill have not been recommended for designation through the agency's land management planning process. Wild and scenic river and wilderness designations must be carefully applied due to their highly restrictive limitations and make sure to take into account existing uses of the land that could be limited, including wildfire risk, public access challenges, and economic concerns raised by local stakeholders. Process does matter. My Democratic colleagues tell us all the time, listen to the science, listen to the land managers, and respect the process. Then we see legislation like this. I know the author's intent was good, but this disregards science, process, and directly ignores the recommendations of the land managers, and we're reminded that the only time they really respect the process and science is when it agrees with them. It is clear this bill falls short of the level of careful application, and it certainly falls short of the level of consensus that should be achieved for a public lands bill that impacts numerous people and interests. Public land decisions should be made with local collaboration and input. I know the author has really tried. They have real consequences for communities on the ground who live with the consequences of these significant federal land management decisions. Regrettably, this committee continues to advance lopsided political winner-take-all bills like this one that may score points with Washington's special interests, but will not ultimately provide the type of lasting compromise or responsible land management that should be the goal of the legislation like that. For that reason, I must urge my colleagues to vote no.
Gentleman yields. Thank you. Anyone else wish? I just want to take the opportunity to congratulate my colleague and our colleague, Representative Huffman, for all the hard work that he and his staff have put into this legislation. I think as a result of that work, one of the, I think, important points that we can't ignore in this legislation and creates the strength of this legislation is the broad local support for all the designations in this bill. And overall, the legislation, I think, strikes a fair balance between conservation, and restoration of public lands in northwestern California. It's exactly the kind of balance that is important. It's a locally driven proposal that I think both sides of the aisle, as we've heard, can and should support. With that, I yield back and ask, is there any amendments to the legislation? Representative Gosar?
Oh, sorry.
With, what?
There's an ANS.
Oh, without objection, an ANS offered by
Mr.
Representative.
Chairman, I object to the amendment being considered read.
All right.
Mr. Halpern?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I do
No,
have...
no.
Wait, the gentleman.
There's objection.
They have to read the amendment.
The clerk will read the amendment.
Amendment number 1. Amendment.
No, the ANS.
Oh, the A. Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 2250, offered by Mr. Huffman of California. Strike all after enacting clause and insert the following.
Keep reading.
Section 1, short title, Table of Contents. Subsection A, short title. This act may be cited as the Northwest California Wilderness Recreation and Working Forest Acts. B, Table of Contents. The table of contents for this act is as follows. Section 1, short title, Table of Contents. Section 2, definitions. Title 1, Restoration and Economic Development.
Mr. Chairman?
Section 101.
Mr. Sublime?
Mr. Chairman, I move that suspend the dispense of the reading of the bill.
I object.
I am making a motion, not seeking unanimous consent.
You can't, it has to be UC.
No, I'm not asking for UC. I'm making a motion to dispense of.
There is no motion to do that.
No, that's of the bill. This is of
Can
the
do it.
amendment. You cannot waive the reading of an amendment.
Keep reading, keep reading.
Section 101,
Clerk will
South
continue.
Fork Trinity Mad River Restoration Act. Section 102, Redwood National and State Parks Restoration. Section 103, California Public Lands Remediation Partnership. Section 104, Trinity Lake Visitor Center. Section 105, Del Norte County Visitor Center. Section 106, Management Plans. Section 107, Study, Partnerships Related to Overnight Accommodations. Title II, Recreation. Section 201, Horse Mountain Special Management Area. Section 202, Bigfoot National Recreation Trail. Section 203, Elk Camp Ridge Recreational Trail. Section 204, Trinity Lake Trail. Section 205, Trail Study. Section 206, Construction of Mountain Bicycling Routes. Section 207, Partnerships. Title III, Conservation. Section 301, Designation of Wilderness. Section 302, Administration of Wilderness. Section 303, Designation of Potential Wilderness. Section 304, Designation of Wild and Scenic Rivers. Section 305, San Hendron Special Conservation Management Area. Title IV, Miscellaneous. Section 401, Maps and Legal Description. Section 402, Updates to Land and Resource Management Plans. Section 403, Pacific Gas and Electric Company, Utilities, Facilities, and Rights-of-Way. Section 2, Definitions. In this act, Number 1, secretary. The term secretary means, subsection A, with respect to land under the jurisdiction of the Secretary of Agriculture, the Secretary of Agriculture, and B, with respect to land under the jurisdiction of the Secretary of the Interior, the Secretary of the Interior. 2, state. The term state means the state of California. Title I, Restoration and Economic Development. Section 101, South Fork Trinity Mad River Restoration Area. A, definitions. In this section, 1, collaboratively developed. The term collaboratively developed means projects that are developed and implemented through a collaborative process that A, includes I, appropriate federal, state, and local agencies, and multiple interested persons representing diverse interests, and B, is transparent and non-exclusive. Number 2, plantation. The term plantation means a forested area that has been artificially
Mr. Chairman,
established by planting or seeding.
I'd ask
Bishop.
unanimous consent to suspend the reading.
Let me think about that. No, without objection, reading is suspended, and Mr. Gosar, you were recognized. Without objection, the ANS offered by Representative Huffman is considered as read and open to amendment at any point. If there's no objection, so ordered. Representative Gosar, you have the first amendment designated number 1, and you're recognized, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is a... Suspend time.
Yeah, Mr. Huffman. Sorry about that.
Sorry, Paul. So that this ANS includes changes that are based on agency feedback and stakeholder concerns. They include those of some county supervisors in my district. So I appreciate Mr. Gosar's earlier comment about Supervisor Groves in Trinity County. He was here to testify that the board at that time had voted 4-1 to maintain a neutral position on the bill. Since then, I have appeared before the board. We had a very long working session, and this ANS that I am introducing right now includes multiple changes that resulted from that conversation with Mr. Groves and other supervisors. So I think it makes the bill a better bill. It makes the bill, frankly, more broadly supported locally, and it includes expanding the remediation partnership statewide to restore lands damaged by illegal grows. It ensures that forest managers have more tools to plan for fires and to manage forests for fire resiliency, and also for maintaining access for utility facilities that are in the rights of way in the public lands that we're talking about here. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I urge an aye vote and yield back.
Gentleman yields. And if there's... Before we go to Mr. Gosar's amendment, if there's no further discussion on the ANS, it's considered read, and with no objection, so ordered. Representative Gosar, you have the First Amendment, sir. Again, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I thank the gentleman from California for updating us. This is a simple amendment that reinforces the tenets of the Wilderness Act, which my friends on the other side routinely refer to as a bedrock conservation law. At the July 10th hearing for this legislation, the Forest Service, in its testimony, conveyed its findings that none of the proposed additions were suitable to be added to the wilderness system, not one. From the USDA testimony, the USDA supports designation of wilderness areas if they have been recommended for designation through the agency's land management planning process, which includes local engagement and public input. Title III includes additions to 8 existing wildernesses, designating 6 new wilderness areas and 6 potential wilderness areas on National Forest Service lands. These additions were not recommended for designation through the agency's land management planning process. Several proposed areas for their potential wilderness designations have a variety of non-conforming uses or conditions affecting wilderness character, including previously harvested areas as well as roads. To declare areas that do not process wilderness characteristics very plainly undermines the integrity of the Wilderness Act, as well as the lands that possess these features. We should not be arbitrarily adding land to the wilderness system if that is not an appropriate designation. It is like the supporters of this legislation simply read a Wilderness Society press release and want to declare all these lands simply wilderness regardless to their actual conditions. It is critically important that the wilderness designations are carefully applied due to their highly restrictive limitations, and make sure to take into account existing uses of the land that could be limited, including wildfire risk, public access challenges, and economic concerns raised by local stakeholders. In addition, if we haven't noticed, forests in the West are burning, laying hundreds of thousands of new wilderness into areas, ensuring that none of these lands will be managed, none of these lands will receive fire treatment, continues the trend of failure to protect the people and resources we are here to manage. To randomly designate areas as wilderness that do not possess wilderness characteristics, especially in areas that have been affected by massive wildfires, is both reckless and unwise. The federal government has an obligation to the landowner, as well as the custodian of the U.S. Citizen, not to simply lock these lands away until they burn, but to responsibly conserve these lands for future. The folks on the other side always tell me about process. NEPA this, NEPA that. There's a reason for process, and it hasn't been followed here. And so I would hope people would support my amendment, and with that, I will yield back.
Anyone wish to be recognized in Mr. Gosar's amendment? Mr. Huffman?
Mr. Chairman, a couple points in response to my friend's amendment. First of all, the Forest Service, the USDA process for designating wilderness has never been the exclusive way to designate wilderness. It just doesn't work that way. That's never been the singular standard. The wilderness proposals in my bill are very carefully developed. The gentleman suggested that we don't want to randomly designate wilderness areas as if we're just throwing a dart at the map. This is a far cry from that. This has taken place over many, many years. The areas that we have proposed have gone through extensive public review. I've had 4 public meetings in the district. Hundreds of people have attended those meetings and participated in the conversations. In fact, I would dare say that the public process I have had for these wilderness designations far exceeds anything that the Forest Service would ever roll out for any of its recommendations on wilderness. Now, with respect to potential wilderness, which the gentleman just raised, yes, there are some non-conforming uses in some of the potential wilderness areas mentioned in this bill. That's why they are recommended for potential wilderness, for further study and evaluation, and that's why they're not included in the formal wilderness designations. I think that's the appropriate way to deal with those particular areas. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Anyone else wish to speak on Mr. Gosar's amendment? Sir, you recognized?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to yield my to the gentleman from Arizona.
I thank the gentleman from Georgia. I hear the gentleman from California. But once again, we also have to look at process. We always fall back onto the government's process in regards to federal lands. It's a process that we've been entrusted to, and we've been designated it in law. So it's not easy for us to just skip over that process. And so we have to take into consideration how the Forest Service goes about that. Now, if you don't like that, change the process, but don't exempt it from the process on this project and hold it accountable on everybody else. So from that standpoint, I understand where the gentleman's coming from, but there's a need to have good process. The gentleman may have done, and I suspect he has done incredible process. I know the gentleman to do that. But once again, to usurp the government's responsibility feigns in that support. So I once again ask for support of this amendment.
Gentleman yields. Anyone else? Anyone else?
Is Mr. Heiss yielded back his time yet?
Oh,
I'm willing to yield to
Would
the ranking
Mr.
member.
Heiss yield to a question that can be answered by Mr. Gosar?
Be happy to.
Is part of the process, Mr. Gosar, you're talking about, part of your argument that we are establishing a precedent or could be establishing a precedent which would have implications beyond just this particular area of land, but could have implications in other areas too that the federal government owns?
Absolutely. To the gentleman through Mr. Heiss, this is absolutely precedenting possibilities. And so therefore, once again, if you don't like the law, change the law. But you can't have an exemption to that without having the full compensation and review of the law. Process is process.
And then the purpose of your amendment, Mr. Heiss, through you, the purpose of your amendment, therefore, would simply be to extend this stuff specifically to this particular piece of land, or to make sure this is consistent with other areas?
That it's consistent with other areas as due process from the federal government.
Thank you. I appreciate that answer.
Gentleman yields. Gentleman yields back. Any further discussion on the amendment? Are there any other amendments to the legislation? Mr. Lowenthal?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to yield 30 seconds to my colleague from California, Representative Huffman.
I thank the gentleman. I won't be long.
Yeah,
I
you're
just
right.
want
You're
to
right.
respond, Mr. Chair, to this notion that we are somehow doing something unusual or setting a precedent in this bill. We consider and vote on wilderness designations that have not carried with them the imprimatur of a Forest Service wilderness process and recommendation all the time. From members of both parties, it happens all the time. So let's dispel this notion that this is somehow drifting into some new precedent or doing something unusual. Furthermore, if we were to only wait for the Forest Service to come forward with recommendations for wilderness, we'd be waiting a long time. They only do that in conjunction with their management plans, which are decades out of date. So I think on both counts, I appreciate the gentleman, the great faith apparently the gentleman has in the Forest Service process. It's not the only way we designate wilderness, and it's certainly not something we'd want to sit around holding our breath for in this case. With that, I yield.
Yield.
Hearing no further debate on the question. The question is on Mr. Gosar's amendment number 1 to the legislation. All those in favor indicate by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. No. And the opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
As for a roll call vote.
Recorded vote has been requested. This vote will be postponed pursuant to prior announcement. The item for consideration now is H.R. 1708, offered by Representative Schiff. I ask unanimous consent that the Subcommittee on National Parks, Forests, Public Lands be discharged from further consideration of the bill. Without objection, the bill will be considered as read and open to amendment at any point. I will now recognize Representative Lowenthal to speak to the legislation. Mr. Lowenthal.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm happy to claim time today in support of H.R. 1708, the Rim of the Valley Corridor Preservation Act. It's supported by my good friend and congressional neighbor, Representative Schiff. This proposal has been more than a decade in the making and is built off an existing National Park Service study, as well as input from the communities Mr. Schiff represents. The bill would add roughly 191,000 acres to the Santa Monica Mountains National Recreation Area, which is a beloved natural area in Los Angeles, which is one of the most park-poor cities in the country. The preservation area includes a mix of protected and private land, all of which would remain in current ownership. But the bill would allow willing participants to join the National Park Service's efforts to promote equitable and sustainable outdoor recreation in the Los Angeles region. The bill would allow local landowners, local governments, and interested individuals to better enjoy the resources of Southern California and would enhance protections on these lands to preserve them for future generations. To name a few highlights, H.R. 1708 would protect the Los Angeles River corridor. It would be expanding park access, even in downtown Los Angeles. It would protect El Pueblo de Los Angeles, the birthplace of the modern city, and would expand the reach of, quotes, parks as classrooms, unquote, programs, which have already serve more than 13,200 students in Los Angeles, all benefits that are hard to argue against. The majority of the land in this proposal has already been recommended for inclusion in the existing National Recreation Area by the Park Service, and those areas where it goes beyond the National Park Service's recommendations are purely the result of input from local communities who were not included in the original study. I'd like to commend Mr. Schiff for his work on this bill because he really has done an impressive job incorporating input from the local community, from stakeholders, and even from critics of this legislation. The bill includes numerous provisions to protect private property, to protect existing operations, including energy development and water and power infrastructure, while still providing important new access to green space for Los Angeles residents. The sponsor has been working for years with our counterparts across the aisle to build support for this bill, even though that may not be evident from today's discussions. Despite what some opponents of this bill suggest, this proposal does not impact private property or restrict private activities. It does not force federal acquisition of land, and it does not, and let me repeat, it does not limit fuels management or fire suppression. That is made explicit in the text of this bill. What H.R. 1708 will do is provide access to public lands for millions of Americans, including many in underserved communities. And this is no small goal, given the demonstrated benefits green space access has on public health and community well-being. I imagine these benefits are a big part of why California senators and every House member in the vicinity supports this bill, why Los Angeles and Ventura counties support this bill, while nearly every large city in the region supports this bill, and why it's supported by community groups, businesses, and residents on the ground. This is a locally driven proposal that will provide outsized benefits to the communities Mr. Schiff represents, to the communities I represent, and to the people of Southern California. Protecting public lands and ensuring equitable access to recreation are goals I hope we can all support here today. I again want to congratulate the sponsor on his good work, and I encourage my colleagues to support H.R. 1708. With that, I yield back.
Thank you. Before we consider amendment, does any other member wish to be recognized on the legislation? Mr. Bishop.
Mr. Chairman, I move the committee now adjourn. And we do have copies.
Will the clerk distribute the copies? The gentleman moves that the committee do now adjourn. The question is on the gentleman's motion to adjourn. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. No. In the opinion of the chairs, the noes have it, and the motion is not agreed to. A recorded vote has been requested. The question is on the motion to adjourn. Voting is now open. The vote is now closed. Will the clerk report?
Mr. Chair, on this vote, the yeas are 9 and the nays are 11.
The motion fails, and where are we at now? I lost track.
General debate.
That's a very good question.
Is there any further debate before we
Yes.
we begin the amendment process?
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Bishop.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, the committee's not in order.
Committees. The members will please take their seats. Thank you.
For some of you,
Bishop.
we're starting up again. It's good to see so many of you actually here to hear part of the debate. This particular bill is the third iteration that we have had in front of this committee. This is the third sponsor of this particular bill. In each case, the bill changes, and even though Mr. Schiff has made some, tell our staff to shut up. Even though Mr. Schiff has made some modifications, this still has some huge problems that were in the first two iterations of this particular bill. This bill creates 191,000 acres of an increase in the Santa Monica Mountain National Recreation Area. That's a size that's 4 times the District of Columbia. Now, of that 191,000 acres that are going to be extended, only 1,000 actually is owned by the federal government. The rest of it, there are 72,000 that are owned by either state, local, NGOs, special interest districts, special interest groups. But roughly, there's 117,000 acres that are privately owned. Mr. Chairman, can you get the committee in order again? That's 117,000 acres of private property that would be consumed within this new area that's taken place. And even though this, especially once again, this adds more maintenance and more oversight as well as more increases to the maintenance backlog that we already have. And even though this bill does not necessarily give the ability of this new agency or the Park Service the ability to control, we have found that is always what takes place. In fact, Los Angeles County is currently working on a Santa Monica Mountains North area plan, in which case what they have done to private property owners within that particular district is putting restrictions on the commercial properties as well as private properties. Some of their restrictions include restrictions on reception venues and vineyards and guest ranches. They have put a proposal of restrictions that requires a 2,000-foot setback between any facility, a maximum occupancy of 200 for any facility, which includes staff and caterers and photographers and anyone else. The issue that has always been the problem of this proposal is how can you actually do this expansion without infringing on private property rights? And that's why it has always failed in the past, and that's why ultimately this bill will fail in this session as well. Because you still create a situation where you have over 100,000 acres of private property that is going to be consumed by regulations that restrict what they can do, even though technically it does not happen. That has always been the problem with this bill. I admit that Mr. Schiff's staff has tried to solve that problem. The bottom line, if you read what they have come up with, which is much better than the first draft they had, they have tried to go with that. They simply can't solve it. It is too complex. The ability of also creating potential fire hazards is not mitigated in the way this draft comes up here. Those are the considerations. Those are concerns we had back in three sessions ago when this was first introduced by a Republican back then. They haven't solved the problems yet. This is still a problem waiting to happen. I appreciate that, and I appreciate so many of the members being here to participate in this debate. Yield back.
Chairman yields. Is there any further debate on the legislation before we begin the amendment process? Mr. Lowenthal?
Yeah, I'd just like to read from the bill to respond to this, what is construed as a loss of property rights, and that Section 3, I think it's on under Section 2, boundary adjustments, land acquisition and administration. It says, nothing in this subsection or the application of the management plan for the Rim of the Valley unit shall be construed to A, modify any provision of federal, state, or local law with respect to public access to or the use of non-federal lands. B, create any liability or affect any liability under any other law of any private property owner or other owner of non-federal land with respect to any person injured on private property or other non-federal or other non-federal land. Also, it also says nothing in this subsection shall be construed to affect the ownership, the management, or other rights relating to any non-federal land, including any interest in any non-federal land. And D, require any local government to participate in any program administered by the Secretary. I think it's real clear that the bill allows for certain things for the creation, but it protects private property interests. And with that, I yield back.
Well,
Chairman yields. Anyone else wish to be recognized in the debate?
Mr. Westerman.
Mr. Westerman?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And, you know, as I hear the discussion about this bill, I'm wondering, why do we even need it? If it's not going to change ownership, it's not going to change management, if it's not the federal government intruding on property or private property owners' rights, what does the bill actually do? And why do we even need a bill if it's not going to do anything? I think it's really kind of a backdoor approach to long-term eminent domain, where you're going to get these federal designations on private property, and eventually it will impede private property rights. It will impede the management of the land. And also, if you just look at the map, and I would like to submit these maps to the record, the area where this proposed land is, I've got fire maps going back to 2013, and there's been a considerable amount of fire in this new area that would be added to the recreation area. And also, if I understand correctly, there's only 23,000 acres of federal land in the existing area, and last year 21,000 of those acres went up in wildfire. So if it's not going to change anything, if it's just a little bill that doesn't do anything, then my question is, why do we actually need it? And
gentleman yield.
I'll yield to the ranking member.
I appreciate what you're saying. I appreciate what Mr. Lowenthal actually read. That was not prohibitive language. It doesn't prohibit those types of activities. Say some NGO wants to have the decibel level changed at some time. You don't prohibit this new entity that's an overlay from doing that in the future. If you really were trying to protect those rights, you prohibit the practice up front. You prohibit it, not simply saying it will not have an impact. And there is some language that we have used as boilerplate language in other areas to specifically guarantee those rights. It's not included in this particular one. That's one of the problems with this piece of legislation, which is going to be a hindrance for it going further. With that, I'll yield back to Mr. Westerman.
and I ask to submit these maps.
Without objection, sir.
And I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Any further discussion? Costa?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, what seemed like another lifetime ago, I used to chair the subcommittee in the state legislature that had jurisdiction on all of this area. And so I'm very familiar with the Santa Monica Mountain Conservancy and the other conservancies within California that have played a very important role in terms of trying to provide lands for all of Californians to use for multiple use purposes. And these conservancies, frankly, have been very successful over decades. I believe Congressman Schiff is attempting to complement the efforts with the Santa Monica Mountain Conservancy, and the maps that were noted here show the bridge on the land area that complements that effort. So the Santa Monica Mountain Conservancy, where millions and millions, primarily of Southern Californians, use these lands for multi-purpose use. As it relates to two elements on the amendments, I think one of the Fulcher amendments I'm concerned about, because we have a practice that I've been involved in the past where we have friendly condemnation, where the seller wants to sell the property, but there are tax benefits toward a condemnation. So they exercise an effort where, in this case, it might be the Santa Monica Mountain Conservancy, or it might be another entity, agrees to condemn the land because the seller wants to sell it, and as a result, they have an agreed price. But then there's a tax benefit that accrues to that as a result of that effort. I'm not so sure this First Amendment would allow that to occur, and so I have a problem and would oppose the First Amendment. The Second Amendment, I think, is important, and I'm going to support it. For those of us who are familiar with this part of California and the horrific fires that have occurred, and I don't mean to be, this isn't meant to be a pun, but I mean, this is chaparral country. There's no raking of land. And the Santa Ana winds are problematic, and they have been, for decades. And of course, with changes of climate, they're becoming more problematic. So having this amendment that makes sure that there's a fire protection component in the adoption of these new lands, and to ensure that, as the amendment describes, that there are efforts to reduce fuel and other remedial action that can be taken place to try to prevent that, I think is a good thought, and I would support that amendment, and I intend to support the legislation. With that said, I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Any further discussion? If there's no further debate before we begin the amendment process, without objection, the ANS offered by myself is considered as read and open to amendment at any point. So ordered. Representative Fulcher, you have the First Amendment designated as number 1, and you're recognized, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And after hearing the dialogue already, I'm actually encouraged, because with Mr. Lowenthal's words and Mr. Costa's words, I think we might be in complete agreement on this particular amendment. But what this amendment does is it seeks to limit the authority of the Secretary of the Interior to acquire land within the rim of the valley expansion simply to donation or exchange. It removes the willing seller component. And as has already been conveyed, with the addition of that amount of land, there is inevitably going to be a new management plan that's required to address that additional acreage. And with that incremental plan, as spoken to by the ranking member, that is often a stepping stone to provisions that make it much, much easier for that to be acquired by the federal government using taxpayer money to purchase that federal land. Oftentimes, third parties get involved with that and say this is the intent of Congress, and we've seen it happen in my home state, and certainly the door is open for that here. The proposed rim of the valley expansion is 191,000 acres, and only about 1,800 acres are currently federally owned. So within the current Santa Monica Mountains National Rec Area, only 15% of the acreage is federally owned, which means that 85% is, the National Rec Area is drawn around private, state, and local property. So my concern and why there's this amendment here is that giving the National Park Service the broad authority to acquire those lands from willing sellers, and how this process and the new management plan may open that up. I just don't think we should open the door to utilize taxpayer dollars. And again, I think that the new management plan would inevitably make that easier to do. Again, speaking from the experience operating within our own state, the federal government overall is way over its head when it comes to trying to manage all the federal land that we've got. At a time when the National Park Service backlog is approximately $12 billion, and that's the backlog, our efforts should be working to better maintain our parks and not provide the Park Service with a situation where they could add burden on itself by significantly adding more acreage to manage or purchase. So we've had this exchange already. In a nutshell, that's what it does. It removes the willing seller component. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Any discussion on the amendment?
Mr.
Lowenthal, you recognize?
Mr. Chair, I oppose the amendments. I think it's well-intentioned. I understand where the representative is coming from, but I want to say a few things. One is, what we're seeing here is that originally the National Park Service was the one that recommended 171,000 of the 190. So almost all of the land was previously had been recommended for this, to become part of the Santa Monica Mountains and become the Rim of the Valley Corridor Preservation Act, because it had already been recommended. The other 20,000 or so, a little less than 20,000, had all come from the community, the landowners, the businesses, tremendous support, because this really, if you know, living in an urban area, this increases the value of their homes to be around there. So this was tremendously supported by the communities themselves. You may not like it, you may not want it, but this is what this community desperately wants. And I think that it protects these lands for future. Many people want to see that happen. It's already very explicit in the bill, as I read before. Any purchase has to be from by the federal government, has to be from a willing seller. Condemnation is strictly prohibited. With that, I oppose it. Well-intentioned, but I oppose this amendment.
Anyone else wish to speak to the amendment? And hearing no further debate, the question is on the Fulcher Amendment number 1 to the ANS. All those in favor indicate by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed say no.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it, and the amendment is not agreed to. A recorded vote has been requested. This vote will be postponed pursuant to prior instructions. I'll get it. Representative Fulcher, you are now recognized for your next amendment, number 2. You're recognized for 5 minutes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We're getting to know each other more just in today than we have the whole year so far. Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk. And this amendment would require that the current fire management plan for the recreational area to be updated to specifically address the unnatural fuel load and the buildup thereof. Mr. Chairman, we need to make it easier to manage our federal land, not more difficult. We witnessed the devastation in California last year due to fires, just like we've seen it many times before across the West. And I don't live in California, but I've certainly had similar experiences in my own state. And when those kind of disasters happen, all the taxpayers pick up the tab. And one of our goals should be to make it easier to treat the fuel buildup on all of our federal lands. Last year's Woolsey fire caused significant damage to the Santa Monica Mountains National Rec Area, It burned almost 100,000 acres. Most of western town at Paramount Ranch was destroyed, as well as the 1927 Peter Strauss Ranch house, the Rocky Oaks Ranger Residence, museum building, and part of the UCLA Lacrette's field station. And in total, roughly 88%, or 21,000 of the 23,595 National Park Service acres within the current Santa Monica Mountains National Rec Area has burned. Current fire management plan for Santa Monica National Rec Area, which last was updated in 2012, states that, and I quote, "Fire management actions in the SMM-NRA need to deal primarily with fire hazards created by development at the urban-wildlife interface and not to correct unnatural fuel buildup on the landscape." Now, while we acknowledge that the NS includes a savings provision stating that nothing in the Act limits Secretary of Interior's ability to update the unit's fire management plan, which may consider various fuels management strategies, I also noticed it doesn't make it any easier to manage these lands. We need to require the Secretary to address the unnatural fuel buildup on the landscape to better protect the land, the lives and property of those that live in and near the boundaries of the proposed Rim of the Valley unit. I fear if we don't, these devastating events will continue to happen. So, Mr. Chairman, with that, I yield back.
In discussion, Mr. Lowenthal.
Thank you, and I truly do understand the gentleman's concern. As a Californian, as a representative of Los Angeles, I and all my colleagues from California always understood that fire is an issue that none of us take lightly. We're living through it, and so we are all understanding of that. But for the very same reasons, I'm going to have to oppose the gentleman's amendment. The base text of this bill is explicit. Nothing shall prohibit the National Park Service's ability to perform fire or fuels management. The bill already provides the flexibility needed to do the appropriate management, which I believe we all support. Park Service will update the applicable fire management plan as soon as possible after this addition has been added. That is the authority they already have, and they will continue to have when this bill becomes law. So I thank the representative for his comments about fire. It's already covered in the bill, and I urge a no vote on the amendment by Mr. Fulcher.
Gentleman yields. Number 2. If there, hearing no further debate, the question is on the Fulcher Amendment number 2 to the ANS. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. Recorded vote has been requested. This vote will be postponed pursuant to prior announcement. Going to. The item for consideration is H.R. 2199, offered by Representative Carvajal. I ask unanimous consent. Subcommittee on National Parks, Forests, and Public Lands be discharged from further consideration of the legislation, and without objection, the bill will be considered as read and open to amendment at any time. I will now recognize Representative Huffman to speak to the legislation. Sir?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to thank my colleagues, Representative Carbajal and Senator Kamala Harris, for introducing this legislation. I'm proud to support it, along with nearly 30 of my other colleagues from California. H.R. 2199, like other bills we're hearing today, provides common-sense climate solutions by protecting high conservation value public lands and waters, while also enhancing recreational opportunities in support of our multi-billion-dollar recreation economy. The bill would designate approximately 250,000 acres of public lands as wilderness. It would add 159 river miles to the National Wild and Scenic River System as well. The bill would designate 2 new scenic areas, designate the Condor National Scenic Trail, and require studies to enhance other recreational opportunities, including through hiking, mountain biking, and off-highway vehicle recreation. The lands in this bill are primarily in the Los Padres National Forest and the Carrizo Plain National Monument, which might sound familiar if you've heard of the super bloom. When spring conditions are right, tens of thousands of acres of wildfire erupt across the Carrizo Plain, painting the deserts and the prairies along the San Andreas Fault. With its energy dominance agenda, the Trump administration has provided an important reminder that without strong, permanent protections, wild places like the Carrizo Plain could be gone faster than a fleeting spring superbloom. For this reason, it's incumbent upon members of Congress and this committee to recognize areas with wild characteristics and other special values, and to take appropriate steps to ensure their permanent protection as wilderness or through other protective designations. So I'm proud to support this thoughtful conservation effort of my California colleagues, and I urge all members to support it, the Central Coast Heritage Protection Act, as well as other California public lands in our markup today. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Before we consider any amendments, does any other member wish to be recognized on the legislation?
Yeah, just very briefly.
Mr. Bishop.
Thank you. One of the reasons I oppose this one is because we have a common theme coming. Of the 11 wilderness proposals in this bill, only 3 were recommended for designation through the Forest Service land management process. It's not actually going through the process, but this is an effort to pay off interest groups, so I yield back.
Any further discussion on the legislation? Without objection, the ANS offered by myself is considered as read and open to amendment at any point. And are there any amendments to the legislation? There are no further amendments. The question is on adopting the ANS. All those in favor say aye. All those opposed, no.
No.
No. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the ANS is adopted. If there are no further amendments, the question is on adopting the bill as amended. An order in favor reported to the House. All those in favor indicate by saying aye. All those opposed, no.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the bill, a recorded vote has been requested. This vote postponed pursuant to prior announcement. The item for consideration is H.R. 2215, offered by Representative Chu. I ask unanimous consent that the Subcommittee on National Parks, Forests, and Public Lands be discharged from consideration of the bill. Without objection, the bill is considered as read and open to amendment at any time. Before we consider amendments, does any member wish to be recognized on the legislation? Gentleman is recognized. Mr. Cook.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. This bill has been around for quite a while. It was introduced during the Obama administration, and it has, ironically enough, it's introduced by a representative from Los Angeles. And my biggest concern, although there's many concerns, is the fact that there's 4,873 acres that belong to San Bernardino County. And San Bernardino County, with the vote of the supervisors and many of the local small unincorporated communities, are against this. And the other one that very, very worried, there's a recreational area called Mount Baldley. Now, this area is, we're not talking about a very large area. It's 4,000 acres. That's about the size of Mr. Lowenthal's backyard. But it's, excuse the pun, but it's very, very disconcerting because getting up to that area and is very, very difficult because of the roads going there. We've had problems in the past where the road has been closed because of fires, because of some of the storms that the rocks have come down there, very, very dangerous. In fact, I think we had 2 deaths in this several years ago. All the equipment that went in there was San Bernardino County and some of the local communities to help out the residents from that area. The biggest concern, of course, is many of the people that go up there to recreate. It's going to have a major impact on Mount Baldy. They feel that this will close that ski resort, and I think they're right. And there's another area, surprisingly enough, there's an artificial reservoir there that is owned by Mount Baldy. And a few years ago, we were trying to make sure that they got their water back that they had loaned, and I don't know how you can loan out water from a reservoir, but it was used by the Forestry Service to put out the fire. Now, those of us in California know how hard it is to create reservoirs or anything like that. But it's something that the first concern of Mount Baldy, of course, is they use that to manufacture snow. All of this, in my opinion, will be in danger. We've tried to negotiate over the years. You know, our biggest compromise, and I'm concerned about the rest of the area, but the area is, hey, you experts from LA, how come you know so much about San Bernardino County when the supervisors and all the locals are against this? Tell me why. If you really care, well, you know, it's the environment and everything. I understand that. But this is local government against big government. And we have tried and we have lost. We have tried to negotiate over and over again. This is, and most of you know me. I think I'm pretty bipartisan. And I don't get excited about that many things, but this one's got me excited because it's part of my district. And if there's any comments about where my future is going, this is not in the supervisor's district that I intend to run for. So no conflict of interest. It's just the right thing to do. So I yield back. I hope that you will consider that take it back. Let's negotiate. We wanted to do it, but it's here we go again. And I'm not going to say that we haven't had fights with San Bernardino, Inyo County, with LA. I'm only going to send everybody a copy of the movie Chinatown and all the water that's come down from Owens Valley. No, I'm not going to go there, although it's coming up again. But these are battles that go back a long, long while. And this is another one. And I'm here to represent my county, those folks, and I'm going to dig my heels in on this one. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Any further debate before we begin the amendment process? Without objection, the ANS offered by myself is considered as read and open to amendment at any point. So ordered. Are there any amendments to the bill? If there are no further amendments, the question is on adopting the ANS. All those in favor indicate by saying aye. All those opposed?
No.
The opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the ANS is adopted.
As for
Go to this one. If there's no further amendments, the question is on adopting the legislation as amended and order it favorably reported to the House. All those in favor indicate by saying aye. Opposed? No.
no.
In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the bill is ordered favorably reported as amended, and the motion to reconsider is
As
laid.
for a recorded vote.
Gentlemen, ask for a recorded vote. The vote will be postponed pursuant to prior announcement. Where are we at?
This was Chu's bill. I was against.
The item for consideration is H.R. 2546, offered by Representative DeGette. I ask unanimous consent that the Subcommittee on National Parks, Forests, and Public Lands be discharged from further consideration of the legislation. Without objection, the bill will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. I will now recognize sponsor of the legislation, Representative DeGette, to speak to her legislation. You are recognized.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this important markup today. This is an important day for my state of Colorado. For the past 20 years, I've been working on legislation to permanently protect more of Colorado's wilderness for future generations to enjoy. As a fourth-generation Coloradoan, I know how important our public lands are to the people of my state. They're part of what makes our state so unique. They are why millions of people come to Colorado to visit, and they're why so many of us are proud to call it home. Protecting our remarkable landscapes that our state has to offer is vital, not just for the health of our environment and our economy, but it's also important to our identity and overall way of life. In 1999, shortly after I was first elected to Congress, I was approached by a group of citizens who had been working for years to identify untouched areas throughout our state that could qualify as wilderness. And you see some of those areas up there on the screen and in the books that I've given you right here, sitting here. For more than 20 years since then, I've been working hand to hand with those citizens and also with residents and community leaders from across our state on the legislation that we have before us today that will permanently protect more than 600,000 acres of wilderness across Colorado. From the areas such as the dramatic ridgeline vistas of Grand Hogback, which we just saw, and the sprawling plateaus of Little Book Cliffs. Areas like the stunning red cliffs of Dolores River Canyon and the winding riverways of the Browns Canyon. Areas that have been untouched by man and that offer visitors a glimpse into how the world looked before we started to change it. This bill would permanently protect 32 unique areas across our state from the threat of future development and the destruction caused by drilling for oil and gas. It will help grow Colorado's thriving tourism economy and our multi-billion-dollar outdoor recreation industry. And while 2/3 of the areas in this bill have been designated wilderness study areas for over 30 years, providing these majestic landscapes the permanent protection they deserve will ensure that they remain available for years to come. The Colorado Wilderness Act is one of the largest Colorado land protection packages that Congress has ever considered for our state, and it's the result of 2 decades worth of our work. It's the product of countless community meetings and dozens of visits to some of the most remote parts of our state. It's been drafted, it's been redrafted, scrutinized and analyzed, and now it's ready to become law. The only thing that's more amazing than this land that the bill will protect is the support that we've received along the way. I've received more than 14,000 letters of support from Colorado residents. I've received endorsements from over 350 business leaders throughout Colorado, as well as dozens of organizations and local government leaders. The maps that you have before you are the product of countless hours spent by a dedicated group of citizens who've been on the ground conducting inventories, mapping boundaries, and exploring some of the most remote areas of Colorado. I myself have personally experienced the wonderful wilderness areas that we see by foot, by horse, by raft, and even camping in most of the areas that are in this bill. I've met with landowners and ranchers, business leaders and elected officials to get their feedback on this plan and where necessary to adjust it. My staff and I have worked hand in hand with groups like the Outdoor Alliance and the Outdoor Industry Association to fine-tune this bill to ensure that it not only protects our public lands, but it also gives a real boost to our economy. 90% of Colorado's residents participate in some sort of outdoor recreation every year, and more than 2/3 of the people surveyed on the Western Slope say they want Congress to designate more wilderness in this state. If there's one thing Coloradans from both sides of the aisle have been able to agree on, it's the need to protect our public lands. Let's give the people of Colorado what they want. Let's turn this pivotal moment in our fight to protect Colorado's wilderness into a historic one. Let's get this bill passed and signed into law. so that our children and our grandchildren can one day enjoy the irreplaceable landscapes that make our state so great. I just want to take these last seconds, Madam Chair, to thank the committee staff for working hard with us, to thank you and the chairman for working hard with us, and mostly to thank my wonderful staff for all of the work that they've put into this bill for the last 20 years. I yield back.
Is there any further debate before we begin the amendment process? Mr. Lamborn?
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and I will be not offering some amendments that I had previously turned in. And I'll explain why in a minute. And I want to, first of all, thank the sponsor of the bill for working with me on this. We've had a sit-down meeting in my office. We've had some shorter conversations here and there around the Capitol on different occasions. And so I want to say I appreciate her outreach on this legislation. And I also want to say that I believe that wilderness is a well-intended and is a worthy goal. There's a philosophical issue of whether or not the restrictions on wilderness really make it conducive to the use of enough people out there in our society. And the restrictions, I come down a lot of times on it being too restrictive. For instance, people with motorized wheelchairs or any other kind of motorized vehicle, arguably bicycles, agencies that need to go in and thin out the dangerous accumulation of excess fuels. You know, all that's not allowed in a wilderness designation. And yet, if the land we're talking about is under federal control, it does get a lot of federal protection already. But more people can use it. I'm just for more people using the land for more reasons. And I think that that's the best for the most people. So anyway, when I weigh all that in the balance, and I weigh one other consideration, and that is, are the people who are representing the areas being fully brought into the process? I'm troubled. I have some of the areas that are in this bill, and so that's why I appreciate Representative DeGette talking to me. But I know that Representative Tipton has the majority of the acreage of this bill in his congressional district. And he's not on this committee any longer. He used to be. He does not believe that he was fully consulted, and he is not supportive of this bill. So to me, that weighs very heavily. So with all that in mind, I will have to oppose this bill and ask my my colleagues to oppose this bill. When it comes to opposition, I think this is significant. And I would like to, in a minute, I'll ask for UC to introduce into the record, but from the Mesa County Board of Commissioners, they come up with 5 reasons why they do not support this bill. For instance, it would abolish future uses that enhance the social and economic futures of area residents and businesses. They're concerned that more people get to use this land, and instead of it being so tied up through restrictions that that's not any longer possible. They want the ability to manage forest level concerns with the flexibility to address ever-changing conditions, the ability to address the tremendous buildup of natural fuels. It places undue burden on adjacent property owners, and it discriminates against people who can't use horseback or their own feet, including those with disabilities and the elderly. So for those reasons, Mesa County Board of Commissioners has a letter dated June 24th and a resolution opposing this legislation. I'd like to have unanimous consent to enter into the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
And I have a similar letter from the Montezuma County and Dolores County Boards of County Commissioners, a joint letter dated March 26th, once again opposing the legislation. And I'll just read a brief excerpt. In 2012, a wildfire burned over 10,000 acres of private and public lands on Menifree Menifee Mountain, the BLM needs to have maximum management flexibility with pockets of heavily wooded wildlands that are situated within wildland-urban interface. Wilderness, WSA status is too restrictive for lands that adjoin private residential properties without a transitional buffer, and this status hampers the ongoing proactive management along vulnerable boundaries and may hamper opportunities for more rapid and capable fire response. And I would like to introduce this into record with unanimous consent.
Without objection, so ordered.
So for those reasons, I think this is a very well-intended bill. I appreciate the work that's gone into it. I appreciate the fact that you addressed the HATS issue, the high-altitude aviation training sites. There's a couple details there I want to look at, but I think you've worked hard on that, and I appreciate that. And I would urge in the final analysis, though, a no vote, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Lambourne. Ms. DeGette, you have, oh, I'm sorry. Is there any further debate before we begin the amendment process? Mr. Fulker.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, our National Park Service has got a $12 billion backlog. Our U.S. national debt is approximately $23 trillion. And I am not a wealthy man, but I have more money in my wallet than the federal government does. And now we're going to say we're going to add about 607,000 more acres of federal land. What this really does is it puts it that much more at risk. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Is there any further debate before we begin the amendment process? Mr. Neguse.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And thank you to my colleague, Representative DeGette, the Dean of our state's delegation, for her leadership on this bill, which she has worked on for the better part of the last 20 years. And I appreciate her leadership and her passion and her commitment, and I'm proud to support the Colorado Wilderness Act of 2019, H.R. 2546, which she has introduced in this current Congress. I would just say, with respect to the one point made by my colleague on the other side of the aisle regarding the deficit and the debt, without getting into an extended debate here about the reasons for that deficit, in part, of course, by virtue of the tax cut bill that my friends passed on the other side of the aisle last year that gave away billions of dollars to some of the richest Americans in the United States. But I digress. I will just say, for purposes of the bill that's before the committee today, much of the land is already protected in a variety of different ways. I don't believe, and perhaps I can yield a moment at the end of my remarks to my colleague from Colorado to comment further, but I don't believe
the gentleman
that
yield?
I'm going to yield to my colleague, the author of the bill, I should say, although I have much respect for my colleague from Colorado Springs as well. But she can comment a bit further about the reasons why this bill would not greatly increase any costs borne by the federal government. But nonetheless, I would just say that I've heard this from my colleague many times this year, and I agree with her that we run the risk of loving these places to death. And ultimately, the wild places in our state deserve federal protection and logistical support that they desperately need. Protecting public lands is a value that we share as Coloradans. We understand the importance of ensuring that special and unique landscapes are protected not only for ourselves and our children, but for generations to come. Protecting places like those in Representative DeGette's bill is important for maintaining healthy, biodiverse ecosystems. And as someone who represents a congressional district that includes several different areas that are covered by Representative DeGette's bill, I can certainly attest that my constituents in the 2nd District strongly support the protections that are in Representative DeGette's bill. At the end of the day, our public lands define who we are as a state. In Colorado, they contribute to a higher quality of life and an economy that supports $9.7 billion in wages across the state. To the extent that we want to talk about economic impact, that is a statistic that I think is worth underscoring. And of course, I would be remiss if I didn't say that I'm very grateful for the chairman's leadership, Chairman Grijalva, in championing these public land wilderness bills and bringing them both out of committee and onto the floor. And of course, it would be remiss if I didn't mention the Colorado Outdoor Recreation and Economy Act, or the CORE Act, which passed out of this committee in the House of Representatives earlier this year. So as we move forward in this legislative process, I look forward to continuing my work with fellow Colorado delegation colleagues to find compromises where they can be made and to continue our state's tradition of protecting public lands. And with that, I would yield to the gentlelady from Colorado.
I appreciate the gentleman for yielding, and I appreciate you working with me, and I also appreciate Mr. Lamborn working with me. Mr. Lamborn forgot to mention that as well as meeting with him and talking to him in the hall, he also went on a wilderness trip with me to an area in his congressional district, along with his family and my family, and we looked at some of these areas. And I appreciate the dialogue that we've had, and I also appreciate Mr. Lamborn working with me on this high-altitude training issue. It's a really important issue, and I'm glad we're ironing it out. I would just point out two things. The first thing is, we often hear of this issue about wheelchairs in the wilderness and people's concerns about the disabled. The Americans with Disability Act allows wheelchairs in the wilderness and disabled people to go to the wilderness, and so that's not really a factor here.
Motorized?
It's not my time, but I'm not done. In addition, yes. And in addition, I just want to point out with respect to my colleague from Idaho, his comment about the deficit and debt and adding additional public lands, I would point out that virtually all of the land in my legislation is currently public land, BLM land, and 2/3 of the land has been managed as wilderness study areas for over 30 years. So it's not really going to cost any money in addition to what we're already paying for this. And with that, I would yield back to Mr. Neguse and thank the gentleman for his support.
Thank you, and with that, I would yield the balance of my time.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Bishop?
I would yield my time to Mr. Lamborn and wonder why he was walking in wilderness areas, so you destroy the definition of wilderness.
He was joking. He was joking. Mr. Neguse, thank you for your comments. I agree with you that we want our children and grandchildren to also enjoy these beautiful places of Colorado or anywhere in our country where they may be found. But as has been pointed out, all of these lands are under federal protection right now. They are protected. But they are more open to a number of uses as opposed to what wilderness allows. With wilderness and Mr. Fulcher, and actually it may cost less when it becomes wilderness because they basically lock it up and throw away the key and they do nothing to the land. And wildfires can go through there, whatever, they do nothing. So there are drawbacks to this designation, and one big one is the restrictions on average people being able to use it. I just want the most people to have the most access for the most uses. And we have some wilderness lands already in Colorado. We have wilderness study areas, of which this bill includes some. We have BLM land, we have national park land, we have national forests, and we have state lands, we have city parks. There's tons of federal and other local government lands in Colorado and state lands. But when you make it wilderness, you're really restricting what people can do. And I just don't think the average person who takes a poll and says, oh yeah, I like the idea of wilderness, they don't understand that. And I'll give you an example. I met with a gentleman who had some land that was going to go potentially into wilderness designation. And he said, yeah, but one of the issues is we have to be able to access it sometimes to clear away debris in the stream because it causes flooding. So I just need to make sure I can get my chainsaw in there and undo the log jams. Well, when he realized that that is not possible in a wilderness area, you can't have a chainsaw to undo a log jam in the stream. You have to put up with the flooding that results. He didn't like that idea so much after all. And he was a very informed person, but he was ignorant of that particular restriction. And a lot of people going about their busy daily lives, they don't know all the restrictions on a wilderness area. They simply don't know that. So I just want a panoply of all kinds of public lands for all kinds of purposes, for all kinds of uses. And I think that is a good thing for Colorado, and it's a good thing for our country. And with that, I yield back to the gentleman from Utah.
Gentleman yields. Any further discussion? There's no further debate on the legislation. We will now go to, I thought she wanted to be the last. Without objection, the ANS offered by Representative DeGette is considered as read and open to amendment at any point. If there's no objection, so ordered. Now recognize Representative Curtis. You have the First Amendment designated number 1. Sir, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to dispense with my notes on this amendment and speak from my heart, because this is an issue I feel very strongly about. And like my colleague from Utah, I'm saddened that so many of us are not here to hear what I'd like to say on both sides of the aisle, because this is an important point for me. My amendment would remove Colorado's 3rd and 5th congressional district from this Colorado Wilderness Act. I have experienced firsthand the problem of legislating in other members' districts. Yesterday, I was informed that a member of the Senate who has never spoken to me, wouldn't know my name, and wouldn't know me if he saw me, is introducing a public lands bill in my district. To the best of my knowledge, he's never been there. He has certainly not talked with my county commissioners, the elected officials in the area, or my governor or myself. This is the very same county where we passed significant public lands legislation at the first of this year that was supported by this committee. I have county commissioners who risked their reputation and their election on this legislation, and now somebody's coming behind them to try to change that legislation without even talking to them in my district. That's why this is so sensitive to me. At the beginning of this year, I introduced a rule suggestion that would simply say that we needed to give a member a week's notice before we introduced legislation in their district. This committee rejected that idea and suggested that would never happen. Within 24 hours, members of this committee introduced legislation in my district without talking to me, exclusively in my district. It didn't even run into their district on public lands. What they don't understand is that I work hard every day to bring consensus on these public land issues. And when they legislate in my district, they only make it harder for me because they do not know the issues on the ground like I know them. So my amendment would simply acknowledge that we don't have consensus in the 3rd and the 5th district, that there hasn't been adequate consensus building, and therefore they should be withdrawn. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield my time.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Gett, you recognize.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I want to say to Mr. Curtis, I find it appalling that people would introduce legislation concerning your district and not talk to you. And I also find it appalling that somebody would would not give people any notice when a bill came up in this committee. And I want to let the members of this committee know that I have worked on this bill for 20 years, and I have consulted the members, not just Mr. Lamborn and Mr. Tipton, but their predecessors and the U.S. senators from Colorado the entire decision-making time. And I think that's what's appropriate to do. I also want the committee to know that these 2 congressional districts contain the entirety of my bill. So if this amendment were to pass, my bill would be dead. That's what the effect of this amendment would do. And that's not the right way to go here. I have enormous respect for both of my colleagues from Colorado. They will both tell you that, and they will both tell you that I have worked with them on this. But it's not just one person who controls all of the public land in their district. Public lands belong to everybody. As you've heard from me and Mr. Nagoose, these public lands belong to our children and the grandchildren. And the land in this bill enjoys tremendous public support all across the state. There was earlier this fall, there was a poll done primarily in the 3rd District, but also partially in the 5th District as well. And I will ask unanimous consent to submit a summary of that poll for the record. What this poll showed is that 2/3 of America, 2/3 of people in those districts support additional wilderness designation. County Commissioner Ertel from Montezuma County, Colorado, came and testified at our hearing on this bill, and he accurately said that I had not been to the areas in Montezuma County that are in my bill. So in August, I went down there. I visited those areas. I had a public meeting in Cortez, Colorado, which, by the way, the city government and the mayor of Cortez have endorsed my bill, along with dozens of other public officials around the state. And at the end of that meeting, we had about 90 people show up in Cortez, Colorado. I just on a whim took a little poll of my own. And of the 90 people who showed up, near the 3 areas that are in my bill in Montezuma County, all but 4 said, after hearing about the bill, that they supported this legislation. The support for this bill is tremendous all throughout the Colorado, and the reason is because Coloradoans use wilderness as well as all of the other important public lands in our state. And that's also why just this week, the bill was endorsed by the Outdoor Alliance, the Conservation Alliance, and the outdoor industry. Now, the Outdoor Alliance, and Mr. Chairman, I'd ask unanimous consent to put a copy of their letter of endorsement of the bill into the record as well. The Outdoor Alliance is 10 member-based organizations that include a number of outdoor recreation areas, as is delineated in the letter. The Conservation Alliance has businesses that have contributed more than $21 million towards our economy. And the Outdoor Industry Association serves over 1,300 manufacturers, suppliers, and retailers. This is the level of support we're getting in Colorado now for wilderness. And I'll just say one last thing. I agree with Mr. Lamborn and also with Mr. Tipton and our whole delegation. Not every place should be wilderness. That's why we've worked assiduously for 20 years to make sure that the areas that are included in this legislation are only those areas with strong wilderness characteristics. They will only add, even when this bill is passed, it's only going to be less than 5% of land in Colorado that's wilderness, and that's an important part of our legislation. And so with that, I will yield back.
Any further discussion on Mr. Curtis' amendment? Sir, recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield time to Mr. Curtis.
Thank you. I'd like to thank my colleague and just briefly respond. I sure hope my colleague from Colorado knows that I hope that she's successful. I believe what you've undertaken is a very significant and important thing for your state. One of the points that I would like to make is the likelihood of success, getting a bill all the way through the House and the Senate and into law, without the 2 representatives who, as you've acknowledged, represent 100% of this bill is, in my opinion, near impossible. And would certainly hope that you would continue the many efforts that you have made and alluded to find consensus and work with them. And the second point I would make is you list a very impressive list of people who are supportive of the bill. And it's one of the things I love about our process is that these 2 other members from the Colorado delegation will be accountable in their districts for supporting or not supporting the will of the people. And today, that very same principle is what drove me to go against the grain and support the representative from Colorado, Representative Huffman, and support him with his bill, because he is accountable to those. And so my simple plea is that you'll find a path forward that brings them on board to support the bill. These are important things that you're working on, and their consensus is just so critically important as well. And I yield my time.
I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Any further debate on the amendment? Hearing no further debate, the question is on the Curtis Amendment number 1 to the DeGette ANS. All those in favor indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
Mr. Chairman, I ask for a recorded vote.
Gentleman asked for a recorded vote. The vote is postponed pursuant to prior announcement. To Ms. DeGette. Representative DeGette, you have the next amendment.
I'm not going to intend to, well, I guess I could introduce it with unanimous consent. All right, I have an amendment at the desk.
You're recognized for 5 minutes.
It's Mr. Chairman, as both Mr. Lamborn and I have discussed, this is an amendment on the HATS amendment, the high altitude training. I believe Mr. Lamborn agrees with this amendment, and so I'd ask unanimous consent that it be adopted.
And if the generally would yield, I will
Happy to yield.
agree that this is a good amendment, and I support it. I want to add that there are still a couple of lingering issues, but I think that you've made some great strides in addressing them.
Reclaiming my time, we'll continue to work on those, and at this time, I'd ask unanimous consent for adoption.
Hearing no further debate, if there's no objection, the amendment is adopted. The item for consideration next is H.R. 307. The item for consideration is H.R. 307, offered by Representative Heiss. I ask unanimous consent that the Subcommittee on National Parks, Forests, and Public Lands be discharged from further consideration on this bill. Without objection, the bill will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. Before we consider amendment, does any member wish to be recognized in the legislation? If there's no further debate, before we begin, if there's no further debate, we can begin the amendment process. Is there any amendments to the legislation? There are no further amendments. There are no amendments on the legislation. The question is on adopting the bill and orderly favorably reported to the House. All those in favor indicate by saying aye. 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 All those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the bill is ordered favorably reported, and the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. The item for consideration now is 3794, offered by Representative Gosar. I ask unanimous consent that the Subcommittee on Energy and Mineral Resources be discharged for further consideration of the bill, and without objection, the bill will be considered as read and open to amendment. Before we consider amendment, does any member wish to be recognized on the bill? Mr. Gosar.
First of all, Mr. Chairman, thank you again for including that, as well as Mr. Heiss's bill in today's markup. And we'll keep it that short, because I think there's pretty much everybody on this dais are on board with this bill. So thank you very much. We appreciate it.
The gentleman yields. Mr. Levin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The Public Land Renewable Energy Development Act is a good bipartisan bill that has broad support and will have a real impact. I appreciate Representative Gosar's partnership on this important legislation. As we work to address climate change and reduce greenhouse gas emissions, it's critical that we embrace renewable energy development. That means maximizing the responsible, environmentally sound development of renewable energy on federal public lands. It's important to note that the bill facilitates investment towards the highest quality renewable sources and includes measures to ensure a fair return for impacted states and communities by establishing a revenue-sharing mechanism. The bill also incentivizes development in lower conflict priority areas while ensuring impacts to wildlife, habitat, and cultural resources are avoided and minimized. We've also included important amendments to the bill that increase transparency, strengthen tribal consultation, and clarify which lands get the highest priority for development. I'm proud that Plurita has brought together a diverse coalition that includes 39 co-sponsors, both Republicans and Democrats, as well as conservation groups, sportsmen, and the renewable energy industry. Thank you again to Chairman Grijalva and Rep. Gosar for your attention to this important legislation.
Gentleman yields. Is there further debate before we begin the amendment process? Anyone wish to be recognized?
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to strike the last word.
So you recognized?
I just wanted to go along with the comments that my colleague made on this piece of legislation and also add to it that my bill, also with the Battlefield Preservation Act, has great bipartisan support, and the importance of that is significant at this time. And I was surprised when that bill was part of this markup, then it was removed from the markup, then it was put back on the markup, and I don't know all the details behind there, but I want to thank you and Ranking Member Bishop for working together to bring this back on the table. And my support on the other side of the aisle, we've got, I believe, 93 co-sponsors, and split right down the middle on support, and I just want to thank you for bringing this back up on this markup. I yield.
Gentleman yields. If there's no further debate, we can begin the amendment process. Representative Levin, you are recognized for your amendment designated as 33.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The amendment has been passed out, and you're recognized for 5 minutes, sir.
The bipartisan manager's amendments make small language adjustments to the bill and incorporates feedback from outside stakeholders in the environmental community and industry. I urge my colleagues to vote yes on the amendment and the underlying legislation. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Hearing no further debate, the question is on the amendment number 33. All those in favor indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? The ayes have it. The ayes have it, and the amendment is adopted. If there is no further amendments, the question is on adopting the legislation as amended and ordering it favorably report to the House. All those in favor indicate by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the bill is ordered favorably reported as amended, and the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Now we begin. What's that? Now we close. Returning to the unfinished business, final passage, Protect Our Refugees Act, Ms. Velasquez's piece of legislation. The question is on adopting H.R. 2854 and ordering it favorably reported to the House. Members will record their votes. Has every member voted? What's this? What's 307? If all members voted, voting is now closed, and the clerk will report.
Mr. Chair, on this vote, the yeas are 17 and the nays are 13.
The ayes have it. The bill is ordered favorably reported, and the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Now we do amendments to H.R. 2250, Northwest California Wilderness, Mr. Huffman's legislation. The first amendment is amendment designated number 1. With the members will record their vote. Didn't we do this already? No, we didn't. Vote. It's go-star number 1. Has every member voted?
Mr. Fulcher?
Thank you. The voting is now, Ms. Gonzalez. Has everybody voted? If so, the voting is now closed, and the clerk will report.
Mr. Chair, on this vote, the yeas are 13 and the nays are 18.
The nays have it, and the amendment is not agreed to. The question is on Representative Huffman's ANS to H.R. 2250. All those in... Nope, you didn't ask? No, okay.
So please go through the ANS.
You can do that voice.
The question is on Representative Huffman's ANS to H.R. 2250. All those in favor indicate by saying aye. Opposed? In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the ANS is agreed to. Final passage, H.R. 2250, as amended and ordered in favor reported to the House. Members will now record their vote. Oh, one voice. All those in favor indicate by saying aye. All those opposed, no?
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it.
Roll call.
Roll call's been asked, requested, and now we can record our votes.
They said we couldn't do it. They said we couldn't do it.
Has everyone voted? Has everybody recorded their vote? If so, voting is closed. The clerk will report.
Mr. Chair, on this vote, the yeas are 22 and the nays are 11.
The ayes have it, and the bill is ordered favorably reported as amended, and the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Amendments to H.R. 1708. The amendment designated as Vulture number 1. Voting is now open. Members will record their vote. Vulture number 1, 1708. this one, didn't we? Have all members voted? If so, the clerk will report.
Mr. Chair, on this vote, the ayes are 13 and the nays are 20.
The amendment fails and is not agreed to. Recorded vote on amendment designated Mr. Fulcher number 2, and the voting is now opened. Has everyone voted? The voting is now closed. The clerk will report.
Mr. Chair, on this vote, the ayes are 16 and the nays are 17.
The nays have it, and the amendment is not agreed to. The question is on my ANS to HR 1708. All those in favor indicate by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the ANS is agreed to. The question is on adopting HR 1708 as amended and ordered in favor reported to the House. All those in favor indicate by saying aye. 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 Opposed, no. No. In the opinion of the chairs, roll call been asked for, and voting is now open, and members will please record their votes. Has everyone voted? If so, the clerk will close. The voting is now closed, and the clerk will report.
Mr. Chair, on this vote, the ayes are 20 and the nays are 13.
The ayes have it, and the bill is ordered favorably reported as amended, and the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. The question is now on adopting Question now on adopting HR 2199 as amended and ordering it favorably reported to the House. All those in favor indicate by saying aye. Opposed? No. No. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the bill is ordered favorably reported. Roll call being requested. The voting is now open, and members will record their vote. All members have voted. Voting is now closed, and the clerk will report.
Mr. Chair, on this vote, the ayes are 20 and the nays are 13.
The bill is ordered favorably reported as amended, and the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. question is on adopting H.R. 2215 as amended in order favorably reported to the House. All those in favor indicate by saying aye. Opposed indicate by saying no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. Roll call's been requested. Voting is now open. Members will record their vote. I wasn't sure about this one. All members have voted. Voting is now closed, and the clerk will report.
Mr. Chair, on this vote, the yeas are 20 and the nays are 13.
The ayes have it, and the bill is ordered favorably reported as amended, and the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Amendments to H.R. 2546. The amendment designated as Curtis number 1. The voting is now open. Didn't they get accepted? I still do this? No? Have all members voted? If so, the voting is now closed, and the clerk will report.
Mr. Chair, on this vote, the yeas are 13 and the nays are 20.
The nays have it, and the amendment is not agreed to. The question is on Representative DeGette's ANS as amended to H.R. 2546. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed? No? No. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the ANS is agreed to as amended. The question is now on adopting H.R. 2546 as amended and ordering it favorably reported to the House. All those in favor indicate by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed, no? No. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. Recording vote having been requested, voting is now open, and members will record their vote. We're missing a lot of guys that don't come in. He doesn't come. No, he's sick when we're investigating his ass. All members have voted. The voting is now closed, and the clerk will report.
Mr. Chair, on this vote, the yeas are 21 and the nays are 13.
The ayes have it, and the bill is ordered favorably reported as amended, and the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. All members, in closing, all members have 2 days in which to file supplemental and additional minority or dissenting views. I ask unanimous consent to staff be allowed to make necessary technical and conforming changes to the bills order reported today, subject to the approval of the minority. I also ask unanimous consent for any bill ordered reported today with amendments that the bill be considered reported with an amendment to strike out all after enacting clause and insert the text of the bill with its perfecting amendments adopted in committee. Without objection, so ordered. And if there's no further business, the committee is adjourned. And thank you very much for your patience, endurance, and indulgence.